we are recording this meeting so that other members that were not able to make it today can watch it later on.
अनि हामीले चाहिँ आज यो कार्यक्रम रेकर्ड पनि गर्दैछौँ ताकि हामीले पछि छुटाउनु हुने कोही हुनुहुन्छ भने पछि उहाँहरूलाई देखाउनको लागि
The member organizations of CUSP are Adhikar, Haitian Bridge Alliance, also the National Network for Arab American Communities, African Communities Together, and the UndocuBlack Network.
अनि कप्समा आबद्ध भएको संस्थाहरू हाम्रो गठबन्धनमा आबद्ध भएको संस्थाहरू चाहिँ अधिकार, Haitian Bridge Alliance, National Network for Arab American Communities, African Communities Together, र UndocuBlack भन्ने छ पाँचवटा संस्थाहरू.
So today we are going to be using the interpretation function on Zoom.
आज चाहिँ हामी नेपालीमा दोभाषी पनि गर्दैछौँ यो कार्यक्रम.
At the bottom of your screen, if you are using the Zoom app, you will see a globe that looks like a little round globe at the bottom of your screen, and it should say on it English and Spanish, EN and I think ES.
तपाईको यो जुमको एप चलाइरहनु भएको छ भने त्यसको तलपट्टि चाहिँ एउटा पृथ्वीको जस्तो नक्सा ग्लोबको जस्तो नक्सा भएको त्यो यहाँ मार्क गरिरहेको छ नि हैन देखिरहनु भयो होला स्क्रिन हेरिरहनु पर्छ भने त्यसमा क्लिक गर्नुहोस् हैन त्यसपछि तपाईलाई चाहिँ इंग्लिश अथवा स्पेनिश भनेर त्यसले चाहिँ दुईटा विकल्प दिन्छ.
If you need interpretation into Nepali, go ahead and click the globe at the bottom and select Spanish. When you select Spanish, you will be taken to a different channel where Megha from the Adhikar team will be interpreting into Nepali.
यदि तपाईलाई नेपालीमा दोभाषी चाहिन्छ भने चाहिँ नेपालीमा सुन्न मन छ भने यो कार्यक्रम त्यो पृथ्वीको जस्तो गोलो त्यो चित्रमा क्लिक गर्नुहोस् हैन त्यसपछि त्यसले इंग्लिश र स्पेनिशको विकल्प दिन्छ दुईटा अनि त्यसमा चाहिँ स्पेनिशमा जानुस् है तपाई चाहिँ एमा चाहिँ नेपाली भनेर अप्सन दिदैन जुमले त्यही भएर हामीले स्पेनिशमा राखेका छौं स्पेनिशमा जानु भयो भने तपाईले चाहिँ अधिकारको हाम्रो स्टाफ मेगाले नेपालीमा इन्टरप्रेट गरेको सुन्नुहुनेछ.
So let's take a second and let's try to make sure that everybody that needs interpretation clicks on the Spanish button at the bottom. Just click Spanish and then you'll be able to go to the Nepali room. So let's take a minute, and if you are having issues finding that button, then just speak up and Anil Dai can help you.
कसैलाई नेपालीमा दोभाषी चाहिएको छ भने यो एकचोटि ट्राई गरिहाल्नुहोस् हैन तलपट्टि गएर त्यो ग्लोबमा इन्टरप्रिटेसन लेखेको ठाउँमा क्लिक गर्नुहोस् है अनि त्यसपछि स्पेनिशमा क्लिक गर्नुहोस् अनि एकैछिन हामी यो सेटअप गरौँ कसैलाई चाहिन्छ भने उतापट्टि अर्को च्यानलमा गइहाल्नुहोस्.
So for people that are just coming in, try clicking on the button on the bottom that says Spanish. When you see a round button that says English, right underneath it says Spanish. So just try joining that. And if you have any issues, just unmute yourself and let us know.
फेरि पनि कोही नयाँ भर्खरै आउनु भएको छ भने हैन त्यो तलपट्टि तपाईको जुमको एपको तलपट्टि त्यो पृथ्वीको जस्तो नक्सा भएको ग्लोबमा क्लिक गर्नुहोस् र नेपालीमा दोभाषी चाहिन्छ भने अनि स्पेनिशमा जानुहोस् है अनि केही समस्या भयो भने अहिले अनम्युट गरेर आफुलाई भन्नुस् है त म यहाँ भनिहाल्नुस् है त म तपाईलाई हेल्प गर्न सक्छु.
Megha, can you try saying what I'm saying in Nepali and see if anybody hears you?
टेस्ट गर्दैछौँ अहिले.
हेलो मैले सुनेछु दिदी नमस्ते म रंगिता.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Megha. Okay, if anybody has, as everybody that needs Nepali interpretation in the Nepali channel, you can say, give me a thumbs up.
जसलाई नेपाली दोभाषी चाहिएको छ हैन तपाईले नेपाली च्यानलमा गइसक्नु भएको छ मेगाको आवाज सुनिरहनु भएको छ भने थम्स अप गरेर स्क्रिनमा देखाइदिनुस् एकचोटी.
seeing a few thumbs up. Okay. Mecca, are you good? Okay, great. All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you need Nepali interpretation, Anil Dai, if you don't mind just letting people know how to do so in the chat, that would be great.
हुन्छ कसैलाई नै अब हामी सुरु गर्दैछौँ कार्यक्रम है कसैलाई नेपालीको दोभाषी चाहिएको छ नयाँ आइरहनु भएको छ भने म यहाँ च्याटमा लेखिदिन्छु अनि त्यो ग्लोबमा क्लिक गरेर स्पेनिसमा जाने है थ्यांक यू
Great. So everybody that is speaking or asking questions today, when we're talking about interpretation and going through all of our content together, we want to make sure that we are talking slowly. Sometimes I talk very fast, so if you need me to slow down, just let me know. But one of the main things is let's talk one person at a time, and let's make sure that we're speaking loudly and clearly. So if at any time you can't hear us or we're talking too quickly, just let us know.
आजको कार्यक्रममा अलिकति धेरै कुराहरू छ हैन यसमा अनि धेरैजना उपस्थित पनि धेरैजना हुनुहुन्छ त्यसैले गर्दाखेरि एकचोटीमा चाहिँ केही भन्न पर्यो भने एकचोटीमा एकजना मात्र बोलौं हैन अनि अलिकति राम्रोसँग क्लियरली अलिकति ठुलो आवाजमा बोल्नुहोस् हैन अनि यदि हामीहरुले पनि अलिकति छिटो बोल्यौं तपाईलाई अलिकति स्लो डाउन गर्न मन लाग्यो भने हामीलाई भन्नुहोस् हामी अलिकति स्लो गर्न सक्छौं
Great. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Haddy from UndocuBlack Network to lead us through the training. So the floor is yours, Haddy.
So अब हामी आजको मेन भागमा जाँदैछौं सुरु गर्न लाग्यौं हैन आजको ट्रेनिङ यो चाहिँ हाम्रो UndocuBlack भन्ने संस्थाको ह्याडीले सञ्चालन गर्दै हुनुहुन्छ उहाँलाई खबर छ थ्यांक यू
Thanks so much, Noor and Anil Dai. Like Noor said, my name is Haddy. I work for the UndocuBlack Network, and I'm really excited to be here and so excited to see so many faces and names. This is a legislative advocacy training, but I honestly want it to be as informal as we could possibly have it. So hoping that it's not lecture style. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or use the raise hand function. And yeah. I quickly wanted to make sure, I wasn't sure, Noor, am I pausing for Anil to interpret or is this, okay, I can now go straight through? Okay, yep. Awesome. So then we'll go ahead and jump right in with a question. Since this is a legislative advocacy training, a key part of that is policy. And it's kind of this big word that's used around all the time, thrown around, and can sometimes seem, if not scary, a bit complicated. And so I just wanted to raise the question to you all, like, how do you define policy? And we have a few options here on the slide. You know, do you see it as, you know, a set of laws, whether it's local, state, federal? Do you see policies as rules or regulations, court rulings or like legal cases? Is it sometimes just empty words and disappointments? I think many of our communities can relate to that. Or is it all of the above? And feel free to jump in. You can unmute and say what you think it is, or you can also put it in the chat. I see we already have one answer. Oh, two answers in the chat. Yeah. Belinda, I also feel like it's E. Yeah, and someone else said that it's really good thing how laws, policies, and regulations are formed and lobbied for the better. Yep, all of those are exactly correct. It is all of the above, and I think members of our communities experience the wide array of every single one of these, whether it's laws, court rulings that affect our lives, sometimes just empty words and promises from elected officials. Yep, It's B as well, a lot of rules and regulations. All right, I think we can move on to the next slide, Noor. Yeah, so I will quickly kind of just give an overview of how policies impact our lives and why it's important. And, you know, I may interchangeably say policy or public policy. It more or less means the same thing. And it just really refers to actions that are taken by the government or decisions that are made that are intended to solve some sort of real world problem. And this can happen in a number of different ways. And when we say government, we don't necessarily mean just the federal government. So like all the people in DC, it can be local and state governments as well. I know our Adhikar family, for example, actually does quite a bit of organizing around New York state related policies and things like that. I am based in DC, but our partners at organizations like CASA, for example, also do a lot of policy related work within the state of Maryland and Virginia. And again, it can also be regulatory agencies, which are just governmental organizations that come up with the rules and regulations. And again, these names might sound unfamiliar, but most of us have had interactions with these agencies. If you've ever applied for asylum, for example, you've had an interaction with USCIS, or if you've ever actually applied for a TPS. So we, all of that to say that we do have some level of connection with policy making and policy implementation. Next slide, please, Noor. And this is just like, I think, a very simple breakdown of a lot of the work our CUSP organizations do, which focuses on the federal level of policy. And so it breaks down the 3 branches of government. We have the legislative, which we'll mostly be focusing on today. Which includes Congress, which breaks down into the 2 chambers or houses, which are the Senate, as well as the House of Representatives, which further breaks down for each state, various congressional districts. And then we have the executive, which I think a lot of times when we think of government, that's one of the ones that also comes to mind first. And that includes the president, the vice president, and the cabinet. And a lot of the agencies that I talked about would also fall under that category. And last but certainly not least is our judicial branch of government. And that includes the Supreme Court and the federal courts. So anytime we're talking about a DACA ruling, for example, whether it's a bad ruling from like a Texas court or like the huge Supreme Court victory that we've experienced before, that all falls under our judicial branch of government. And so I kind of broke this down into various, I guess, steps, if you will, of how policies are actually made and implemented. And so I have it from step 1 going down. And so I think the first one is policy agenda setting. In order for any kind of advocacy to be able to happen, in order for you to bring any sort of attention on a certain issue, let alone a piece of law or legislation that you want to be passed, you have to put it on the radar of policy decision makers. And so that's exactly what agenda setting is that you have to identify a problem that exists and call attention to it. And once that issue is identified or a specific event potentially takes place, then it becomes, or it gets on the government's agenda, if you will, it gets on their radar. And an agenda is a list of 1 or more items, topics, or subjects to be acted upon. And so here I have some key examples of public policies that are directly, that they were placed on policy agendas based on real life events or issues that came up. And so example would be new legislation on combating terrorism and slowing immigration would be the US Patriot Act and the Homeland Security Act. Both of these policies were a direct response to the 9/11 attacks and the Islamophobia and the xenophobia that followed those attacks. So in my line of work, and I think in many of our advocacy, we talk about ICE all the time. You know, we talk about fear of ICE raids potentially. We talk about Border Patrol and CBP and how horrible they are towards all migrants and particularly Black migrants. We see those horrible images. It's important for us to note that those didn't always exist. Most of us in this space, I'd say probably all of us, are older than ICE and CBP. They're fairly new agencies that came out as a result of 9/11 and the US government wanting to be stronger on terrorism and also, quite frankly, not wanting to let immigrants in the country. Natural disasters or public health crises can also lead to something being on a policy agenda. Many of us on this call are fairly familiar with TPS, temporary protected status. That's one of those things where it is usually almost always correlated to a specific event. The legal standard for a country to be eligible for temporary protected status is that there must be an extraordinary condition that is temporary, that's making that country unsafe to deport people to. So this could be a natural disaster or an armed conflict. So we see here like a list, and I think most recently we have the TPS designation for Ukraine as a result of the armed conflict happening there. So step 2 in the policy, I guess, to-do list or list is formulation and adoption of policy. All this means is that once you've identified the problem, you then now have to come up with a solution to that problem and adopting that solution into law so it can later be implemented. And there are various ways to do that, but because this is very much focused on legislative advocacy, we're gonna, I think, talk in greater detail about the formulation of legislative policies. Once you identify the issue, you also need to be able, within the formulation, come up with a tangible outcome. And so let's say the issue is many members of our community are TPS holders. They have temporary status, and as a result of that, they live in limbo from 18-month period to 18-month period. That is our problem. The issue or the solution that we want is permanent status and green cards. In order to do that, we need Congress to pass a bill or a law that says that. So that desire to have Congress pass the law, that is the tangible outcome. So a proposed bill that would go before Congress. And then the last bit would be to get the process to the point of adoption, meaning that the policy actually passes and becomes law. We're gonna skip that. Step 4 is the implementation of policy. And I think that's another one that a lot of our members have some familiarity with. And what it simply means is just like, once we get that pivotal victory of actually passing something into law, then the administration has to then implement the law so that it actually benefits us in the way that we want it to. And so, yeah, again, an example of that would be Congress formulated and adopted TPS in the Immigration Act of 1990 in order to give temporary status to members of our community. However, the designation of a new TPS country or redesignation of a current country, while it's decided by the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, it still needs to be implemented. They would need to put out a note in the Federal Register to publicly share that this country is now a TPS country, so people can apply for work permits under TPS. Members of our community would then need to actually apply for the status. A lot of that is handled under USCIS. And so that day-to-day function of making the policy actually work is what we call implementation. And step 5 and 6 are evaluation and termination of policies. And it simply means for evaluation, it's determining how well a policy is working or not working. We know oftentimes laws that are passed don't always work as we imagined. Many members of our community, I think, face a lot of whether it's discrimination or some level of oppression as a result of laws that are perfectly legal that have passed. But whether it's due to a lack of due diligence or advocacy done on certain pieces of the law, they can sometimes turn harmful. And so evaluation is to just make sure that it actually, the intention behind the law, it works in the way that folks wanted it to. And termination just means ending a policy. And a great example of this that we see, sometimes evaluation happens even before a policy can be passed. So UndocuBlack represents Black migrants. A lot of laws that are proposed to pass have criminal bars attached to them, meaning that people who have certain criminal convictions would be ineligible to benefit from those laws or those immigration provisions. And so oftentimes when we're eager and excited for a certain bill, even when it gets close to passing, we're already bracing ourselves for that next fight of making sure that because of the way it's written, it doesn't leave anyone out from benefiting. Another example is the Liberian Refugee Immigration Fairness Program. And it is this beautiful piece of legislation that we were able to get into a defense bill of all things. And it provided green cards and an eventual pathway to citizenship for certain Liberian nationals. But since its adoption, the implementation of that particular policy has been challenging. There have been a lot of roadblocks put in place by USCIS that made it difficult for people to either apply or even get approval for the program. And so while we were in the evaluation stage of that policy, or LRIF as we call it, we very quickly realized that this is not working as we intended. And USCIS is not being a good faith actor in implementing the law as it's written. And so there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of advocacy, even after this law that was supposed to be something very good. We still had to go back and forth with them to hold them accountable, to make sure that the people who are supposed to benefit from the law do so. Another very good and timely example of policies that are harmful that need to be terminated as a result of people evaluating it is Title 42. Title 42 is a policy that pretty much is a de facto asylum ban. It is a CDC policy that was created under the Trump era. And what it does is pretty much say, because of COVID, people should not be allowed to enter the country to seek asylum. So before Title 42, you would at least present at the southern border. Even if you were apprehended and detained, you still had the right to apply for asylum and go through that process. under Title 42, as soon as you present at the southern border, you are subsequently immediately detained and deported or expelled back to whatever dangerous conditions you came from. And so there is a huge push to terminate Title 42. And just to put a finer point on it, even within the discussion around whether or not discussion around terminating Title 42, there's still an evaluation of what that termination will look like. What will that process look like? Will it be done in a way where it leaves certain people out, or will it be done in a way that is equitable, where all people are protected and be able to have access to asylum? So, and there's a lot moving on Title 42 as we speak. All right, I've been talking a lot, so I'm gonna take a step back and we're gonna have another poll. And just wanting to ask if folks have any other policies that they can think of that either being evaluated or that they feel need an evaluation. So can you describe any policies from US history or even right now in the present that were evaluated and determined to be policy failures, or a policy that was evaluated and determined to be a policy success? So for the purposes of this program, again, a policy failure is a policy that does not do what it was intended to do. And for the exercise, a policy success is a policy that did what it was intended to do, or the result, or resulted in some other positive impact. So I'm gonna now shut up for a bit and let folks share some examples. And again, you can either put it in the chat or you can share it out loud.
Hi, everyone. My name is Belinda. So I was going to say DACA, right? Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. But I'm kind of sitting here thinking if it's a policy failure or policy success, just because, from my understanding, and especially as a recipient, it was some sort of...
¿Qué, Didi? ¿Qué to you, Anego?
What's she translating? Oh, okay. Some sort of hold for childhood arrivals to have a Social Security and to work, right? Work authorization. And if that's the case, then yeah, it's a success. However, it's almost as if, like, I mean, it's not almost as if it's not enough, right? There's no pathway to citizenship for these people who have come in at such a young age and are just in this limbo phase, right? And getting older and older and older with no foreseeable pathway to citizenship. So I feel like it was a success in the beginning, right? Like, wow, this passed. Well, I mean, I guess it was an executive order. So like this is happening, it's good. But it's almost as if because it's not doing enough, it may or may not be a failure. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Belinda. Other thoughts on or other examples of policy failures or successes? Okay. I quickly wanted to, respond to the point you raised about DACA is exactly what I was hoping we would hit on. Oftentimes when it comes to policies, it is very, very rarely just like clear cut, yes, good, yes, bad, or yes, success, yes, failure. There's a lot of gray areas when it comes to policies. Circumstances change, the world changes, society's perspectives and views on things changes. So very rarely are policies meant to be this stagnant good thing. Oftentimes they will change with the times. I think another important piece is that something that might be deemed as a policy success by the government in the sense that it is doing exactly what it was intended to do could still be harmful to our communities. Title 42, again, is a great example of that. Although it's framed as a public health policy, it's a xenophobic asylum ban, essentially, and it has caused a lot of harm, particularly to Black immigrant populations. And I think even zooming back out into history, again, it's really important for us, particularly our communities, to ground ourselves in how easily so-called successful policies that are implemented as they were intended to be could still be harmful. This country had a policy where I was not considered a full human being at one point in time, whether it was because of my race and ethnicity or even my gender identity as a woman. Even when we talk about the systems that implement some of these policies like ICE and CBP or local police, those are derivatives of slave patrols who were deputized, and there were policies in place that gave angry white men the right to essentially hunt Black people escaping chattel slavery. And those laws were codified, and they were successful policies. Lots of discriminatory policies, were in existence and still are in existence in many cases in this country. Lynching, the hanging of anybody, oftentimes for discriminatory reasons, did not become against the law up until, was it yesterday or day before yesterday that the president signed it? So this was kind of a trick question to highlight that oftentimes it is not just black and white. Yes, we passed the policy, it does what we intended it to do, and we're all just happy and jumping up and down. It tends to be a lot of gray area and a room for a lot of nuance, especially for communities that are like ours, that are often marginalized and not centered in the decision-making processes of these policies, and not centered in like the larger external narratives around these policies. They become a lot more complicated. I will go back to Title 42 one last time. When Title 42 gets terminated, if it's done in a way where, let's say, the government prioritizes not expelling or deporting families, that would leave single adults potentially to still be victims of this cruel policy. How the West and the US government defines family units is oftentimes not how many of our communities and folks who come from where we come from define family. And so it could potentially also result in family separation if they're only counting a family as a mom, dad, and child, and aunties and uncles and cousins are perceived as single adults. And yet when this policy is terminated, there might be some people who celebrate it as just, yes, this is a simple victory. We've been pushing for this. The policy has now ended. But I think part of advocacy work is doing that extra step of analyzing that gray area and getting really comfortable in that weird gray area and thinking through, does every single piece of this policy or lack thereof or termination or the implementation help our people, or does it harm our people? And that's usually where I think a lot of our work ends up staying. All right, and so now we are going to apply what we've learned, and for me, this will be somewhat of a re-triggering moment. But just to kind of give a very concrete example to all of the various policy steps that I talked about. So we're going to talk about the reconciliation bill. The Senate and the House budget resolution passed with the Build Back Better agreement to put that was at $3.5 trillion. And I think for us, the big victory was that 107 billion of that 3.5 budget was for immigration provisions and instructions to the Judiciary Committee. So the next step after that budget resolution was going to be the drafting of the actual bill, which would have citizenship provisions that would later be presented to the Senate parliamentarian. Then after that, ideally, the bill would have been negotiated on. After the bill negotiations would continue after the parliamentarians' negative opinions, with an active push to disregard the parliamentarian from the CUSP groups. And what we know for right now is that the reconciliation bill has to pass by September of this year, or the process would start all over again. They'd have to come up with a whole new budget resolution and new instructions. So let's go to the next slide so I can break this down a bit. That was like a whole lot of jargon, but essentially budget reconciliation works. This is just, I think, a really good graphic that shows it. There's the budget proposal, then the budget resolution, then the committees submit their legislation. For our purposes, that would be the Judiciary Committee. Then a single reconciliation bill is considered in the House and the Senate. For our purposes, it was already considered in the House and passed in the House and was brought to the Senate by a simple majority. So doesn't need like a 60 vote threshold. Any differences between the House and the Senate version of these bills would need to be resolved. Then it would ideally, in a perfect world, pass by the president, be signed by the president. So that is kind of budget reconciliation in a nutshell. So I think the big question is, in this very big, complicated thing around the country's budget, how in the world did we get immigration in there? How in the world did we even get on their radar to get our stuff on the policy agenda? Remember, this is again like step one of getting on the agenda. Yeah, and the answer is, I mean, you can go to the next slide, Noor, is advocacy, yay. And in all of its various different forms, it's like lots of conversations, wanting our voices to be heard. Many of you have participated in in-person actions and rallies. Lots of you I know have participated in lobby day visits with congressional offices. But the short answer is we were able to get immigration not only into the budget outline, but the budget resolution, and we're able to get immigration passed out of the House in the Build Back Better bill. And I'm going to give specific examples, but yeah, just as I said, advocacy is the act of arguing in favor of something, such as a cause or an idea or policy, essentially raising your voice about something. Lobbying has a more specific definition under tax law, and it's any attempt to influence a specific legislation. So advocacy, I think, is more general. Lobbying is very specific to legislation. And lobbying can be done in two ways. It could be contacting or urging the public to contact a policymaker to try to get them to pass a certain bill, or by advocating for the adoption or rejection of a certain piece of legislation. And our members of our CUSP groups, I need to highlight, have done all of this. especially grassroots advocacy. It's any attempt to influence legislation by affecting the opinion of the general public. And so in the case of CUSP organizations, we tend to encourage the public to lobby and take action. We've had, I can't even remember how many lobby days where people have actually come to DC to not only lobby, but to also participate in direct actions and demonstrations in front of the White House, in front of Congress. And it needs to be referring to a specific piece of legislation and provides information to the public on how to contact decision makers. So all of our social media platforms, whether it's ADICAR or African Communities Together or UndocuBlack, oftentimes there was, especially last year, there was a lot of Instagram and Twitter posts about the reconciliation bill, about Build Back Better, and information about which elected officials should you reach out to pressure to make sure that they supported immigration in these pieces. All of that is grassroots advocacy. And here's a beautiful image of some members of our ADICAR family. And I just really like this quote. I think it also, again, highlights really what grassroots organizing and advocacy is. And it says that nonviolent direct actions seek to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. And it's a quote by Martin Luther King. And I think for the purposes of our work, that community that refuses to negotiate is actually elected officials and Congress. And I think what made the fight to put immigration provisions in the reconciliation bill is that our communities, I think, really came together in a unified voice and recognized that many of our people put these elected officials in office. It is not by accident that Biden is in office or that Congress has a Democrat majority, House and Senate, no matter how slim the majority is. That took hard work, and immigrants played a huge role in that. And so when the Biden administration was inaugurated, I think a lot of our groups were like, okay, we put you in office. You cannot overlook us. You need to deliver to us. And the way in which we decided, or the vehicle that we thought would be best to do that was through the reconciliation process, because it only required a simple majority, which is what we have in the House and Senate. And so direct advocacy is any attempt to influence legislation, again, through communications with the member or employees or other government officials who may participate in creating the legislation. Again, we do this so often. I know many of you have actually sat in lobbying meetings. Many of you have shared your stories, whether directly with staffers or directly with the members or at a legislative briefing. And yeah, these are, I think, just examples of that. Again, our community members, advocates, and other stakeholders demanded that the Democratic Party or all of our elected officials must act to provide all 11 million undocumented immigrants a pathway to citizenship. That was our stance at the beginning of last year. CUSP organizations participated in countless lobby days where we met with elected officials and shared our stories, just like I said. And then even within our movements, I think we made some really, really beautiful strides where there was a point last year where the movement kind of splintered, where there were, after the first negative parliamentarian ruling on a pathway to citizenship for all 11 million, there were members of our larger immigrants' rights movement who wanted to maybe settle for something lesser, which was the parole in place option. And again, very beautifully, those of us who have organizations that are membership organizations that listen day in and day out to the experiences of our members, very quickly were like, no, we cannot settle for this, like another temporary option. We need permanent relief. And we began to disregard the parliamentarian movement and campaign, and that is still in play. Noor, I don't know if you would be able to click the disregard the parliamentarian link.
Let me try that.
And if not, it's fine. Oh, well, yeah. And if you can just, you can X out the pop-up. But, and yeah, further down. So this, I love this website, and we can keep it here. Love this because it's constantly being updated with all of our beautiful organizations' messaging and tweets. And this is a live website, and I get it's just a visual representation of the hard work of last year. And I very vividly remember when the disregard conversation first started. You know, there were a lot of people, both elected officials and movement members, who saw it as kind of not a very serious thing, or that, you know, a little too radical. But because of our collective advocacy, because we were so outspoken about our demands for wanting green cards and nothing less, we were, I think, began to be taken very seriously. And it became, I think, a wonderful movement that is still alive. Like, these tweets are still very active. If you scroll either down or to the side, you might catch like an Adhikar tweet. I might have seen, there's a Haitian Bridge Alliance tweet, an UndocuBlack tweet. And those are changing constantly, but it's just another visual representation of what happens when we decide to move together in unison and raise our voices, and especially as organizations with very similar values. So you can close out of this.
Sorry, Haddy, it might just take me a second.
No, you're fine.
Okay. Okay. Great, we're back.
Thank you, Noor. Sorry about that. All right, we can go to the next slide. And this is just another fun picture of CUSP members. This was actually a meeting that we had at the White House sometime last year. I can't remember when exactly, because time feels weird because of COVID. But this was, again, at the beginning of the reconciliation conversations. And the people pictured here, the Nepali gentleman is a TPS holder. I believe the UBN member standing behind me is a DACA recipient. And I think the gentleman in the gray suit is also a TPS holder. But we went into that room, and I'm in the photo as in, I mean, I was there in my capacity as an advocate, but my family were asylum seekers. And we went into that room essentially advocating that the Biden administration needed to provide our communities with permanent status. And we shared our various immigrant experiences and stories, and shared the common message that we expected immigration provisions that would give our people green cards and a pathway to citizenship to be included in the reconciliation bill, and that it would pass by the end of the year. I think we were very optimistic at that time. And unfortunately, that bill has still not passed, but the work is still ongoing. As you saw, the Disregard Parliamentarian website is still very much active. And so I think these are just like really simple key tools for direct advocacy. And the first one is that whoever is advocating, especially if you're a part of an impacted community, you need to remember that you are the expert. Whether you're in a room full of immigration staffers from a congressional office or attorneys or other immigrants' rights advocates, no one knows your experience like you do. No one knows your story like you do, and no one can articulate it quite like you. So you're the expert in that room. The other thing is to establish a relationship with various offices. And you can do this by highlighting that you're a constituent, or you have some sort of connection to a special interest of the elected official. For example, there are some elected officials that are just really interested in certain parts of the world. And so if someone who is coming to speak with them is from that particular area, that could be a point of connection. Another thing is to have a very clear ask for each conversation. Big picture asks includes like general support for a bill, but it's also important when you have that time with the staffer or the elected official to actually name a small but time-bound ask, whether that's putting out a public statement about something, having them tweet something, or sponsoring a briefing. When you go into your advocacy meetings, it's important to have a clear agenda. Oftentimes when you're talking to congressional offices, they'll only give you a 30-minute window to converse with them. And it's important that you take advantage of every single minute there and that you come prepared. And so, you can have, this is just an example of a simple agenda. I won't go into all of it, but yeah. The other, I think, really big thing is a follow-up after a conversation. Hill staffers in particular have short attention spans, and it's because they're dealing with a million other issues, and immigration just happens to be the one we work on. So it's important to continue to remind them of who you are. So what we usually like to suggest is that you provide them with any kind of educational materials that might help them with their work, whether it's one-pagers or a social media toolkit, the contact information of people, and that you do this within 24 hours of your meeting. And the easiest way to do this is just after you meet with them, literally after the Zoom call ends or you leave their office or whatever, you sit and you type out a thank you email. Dear so-and-so, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We really appreciated your conversation or whatever. Please find below or attached, blah, 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 blah. And you add your resources and you're good to go. And after you wait for an appropriate amount of time, then you also follow up on your ask. So say you had a meeting and one of your asks was that this office put out a statement. I think it would be fair after like 2 or 3 days, if you agreed that they needed to put out a statement by the end of the week, for you to follow up and ask, where the progress is on that statement. All right, we have